June 1942. The Libyan Desert. Erwin Rommel. The dust over the North African scrub is a thick golden shroud. The desert fox stands in his command car. He looks through his binoculars at the fortress of Tobruk. For over a year, this port has been a splinter in the Axis side. It was the ultimate symbol of British defiance. Suddenly, the white flags appear. The fortress falls. 32,220 Allied troops surrender. It is one of the most lopsided victories in the history of desert warfare. In Berlin, the news is a lightning bolt. Hitler is ecstatic. He promotes Rommel to field marshal. Rommel is now the youngest field marshal in the German army. In the eyes of the public, he is invincible. In the eyes of his men, he is a sorcerer of maneuver. But the victory at Tobruk was a mirage. It contained the seeds of a total structural collapse. This was the moment the legend met the arithmetic of the fuel gauge. The fatal mistake was not a loss of courage. It was a choice. It was the decision to prioritize the speed of the advance over the security of the supply line. In the desert, geography is a ruthless auditor. The tankers at the bottom of the Mediterranean were the true hardware of his downfall. This is the technical breakdown of a command decision that cascaded into ruin. The high-speed Camel was about to run out of road. The fall of Tobruk gave Rommel a temporary tactical surplus. He captured massive stockpiles of British fuel and over 2,000 vehicles. This loot convinced him that he could ignore the laws of logistics. Berlin and Rome had a specific analytical plan. Once Tobruk fell, the Afrika Korps was ordered to stop. They were supposed to dig in. They were supposed to wait for the supplies to catch up. The primary strategic goal of the summer was not Cairo, it was Malta. The Axis High Command knew a fundamental truth. As long as the British held Malta, the supply lines across the sea were a death trap. British submarines and aircraft based on Malta were sinking up to 60% of Axis shipping. The plan to solve this was Operation Hercules. It was a massive airborne invasion. It was designed to neutralize the island of Malta forever. Rommel looked at his map. He saw the British Eighth Army retreating in a state of total panic. He smelled blood in the water. He didn't want to wait for an island invasion. He wanted the Suez Canal. He wanted to knock the British Empire out of the war with one final, violent thrust. He sent a direct message to Hitler. He asked for permission to ignore the stop order. He promised he could reach Cairo and Alexandria in weeks. He argued that the British were too broken to resist. Hitler, caught in the high of the victory, gave him the green light. Operation Hercules was postponed. The invasion of Malta was shelved. This was the fatal tactical error. Rommel chose to chase a retreating army into the vastness of Egypt. He did this without securing his back. He traded the security of his supplies for the speed of his tanks. He believed his momentum was a weapon. But the British were not just retreating. They were drawing him further away from his primary bases. They were lengthening his supply line. They were shortening their own. Rommel was now over 600 miles from his main supply port at Tripoli. Tobruk's port was badly damaged. It could only handle a fraction of the daily requirements. The port of Benghazi was also limited. The arithmetic of the desert was beginning to bite. A single Panzer III required nearly 1.5 gallons of fuel to travel just 1 mile in deep sand. With hundreds of tanks and thousands of trucks, the daily consumption was a mountain of liquid. Rommel was entering a ticking clock scenario. His tanks were driving fuel faster than the tankers could arrive. Every mile he moved east was a mile further from his food, his ammunition, and his water. Tobruk was the pinnacle of his career. It was also the moment he stepped into a trap of his own making. The mirage of victory was about to fade. The reality of the Malta blind spot was waiting in the deep blue of the Mediterranean. His tankers were being tracked. His plans were being read. The Desert Fox was moving into a cage made of empty fuel cars. Malta was a tiny speck of limestone in the center of the Mediterranean. To the British, it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. To the Axis, it was a ghost that haunted every ton of fuel. Rommel believed the Desert War would be won on the sand. He was wrong. The war was being decided in the deep blue water between Italy and Libya. The distance from the Italian port of Naples to Tripoli was nearly 600 miles. The route passed directly under the guns of Malta. The island housed British HMS Upholder submarines. It was a base for Bristol Beaufort torpedo bombers. These assets were dedicated to a single task: cutting the Axis throat. In the months leading up to Tobruk, the situation was desperate. In some periods, the Axis were losing 1 out of every 3 ships sent to North Africa. The German High Command knew the math. They developed Operation Hercules. It was a massive plan involving 30,000 paratroopers and a fleet of transport gliders. The goal was to seize Malta and turn the Mediterranean into an Axis lake. If Malta fell, Rommel's supplies would flow without interruption. But Rommel's ego was at a record high. After Tobruk, he convinced Hitler that Malta was no longer necessary. He argued that the British were too broken to use the island effectively. Hitler agreed. He diverted the paratroopers to the Russian front. He diverted the fuel and aircraft to Rommel's thrust into Egypt. This was the blind spot. Rommel was looking at the horizon. He should have been looking at his wake. By leaving Malta in British hands, he left a predator in his rear. The British quickly reinforced the island. New Spitfires arrived. More submarines entered the harbor. The air and sea attacks on Axis tankers intensified. In August 1942, the Axis shipping losses reached a terrifying 33%. By September, the British were sinking over 40% of all supplies intended for the Afrika Korps. Rommel was demanding 60,000 tons of fuel per month to maintain his offensive. He was lucky to receive half of that. Every tanker that went down was a death sentence for a panzer division. The fuel was not just a resource, it was the lifeblood of maneuver warfare. Without it, the tanks were just expensive iron statues. The British didn't even need to sink every ship. They just needed to sink the right ones. They were hunting with a degree of precision that felt impossible. The tankers carrying high-octane aviation fuel and diesel were targeted with eerie accuracy. Rommel suspected a leak in his command. He suspected Italian spies. He was looking for a human traitor. He didn't realize the betrayal was mathematical. He didn't know about the secret war of codes. The British were reading his mail. They knew the name of every ship. They knew the coordinates of every convoy. The Malta blind spot was merging with a hidden disaster in the radio waves. The ultra-arithmetic was about to dismantle the Afrika Korps ship by ship. The betrayal was not happening in the desert sand. It was happening in a quiet estate in the English countryside called Bletchley Park. This was the home of Ultra. It was a massive intelligence operation. It functioned like a factory of logic. Thousands of mathematicians and codebreakers worked here. They were focused on a single piece of hardware, the Enigma machine. The Germans believed this device was unbreakable. It used a system of 3 rotating rotors and a plug board. The machine could be set in 158 quintillion different ways. Every morning at midnight, the Germans changed the settings. They used it to encrypt every vital message. This included the exact schedules of Rommel's fuel convoys. But the British had a counterweapon. They used a machine called the Bombay. This was an early electromechanical computer. It was designed by Alan Turing. It was a machine built to fight a machine. It allowed the British to cycle through Enigma settings at high speed. They weren't just reading troop movements. They were reading the manifests of every supply ship leaving the Italian port of Naples. They knew the name of every vessel. They knew the exact tonnage of the fuel. They knew the route coordinates. This created a mathematical trap in the Mediterranean. The British didn't have to patrol the entire sea. They could concentrate their forces on a single point in space and time. But the British had to be careful. They didn't want the Germans to know the code was broken. If they sank every ship immediately, Rommel would realize his communications were compromised. To protect the secret, the British used a specific tactical ruse. They would send a single Lockheed Hudson or Bristol Beaufort aircraft to find the convoy first. The German sailors would see the plane. They would report that they had been spotted by routine air patrols. An hour later, the torpedo bombers would arrive from Malta. The sinking looked like a result of bad luck. It looked like the consequence of a standard patrol. This ruse protected the secret of Ultra for the entire war. The losses for the Afrika Korps were staggering. In October 1942 alone, the British targeted the tankers Proserpina and Tergestea. Ultra told the British these ships were carrying the final fuel reserves for the defense of El Alamein. On October 26, the Proserpina was spotted and destroyed by air attack. The Tergestea followed shortly after. In a single afternoon, Rommel lost over 7,000 tons of fuel. This was fuel he had already spent in his tactical plans. He grew increasingly paranoid. He accused the Italian Naval Command, or Supermarina, of being filled with spies. He searched for human traitors. He checked his phone lines. He looked for a physical source of the leak. He never suspected the radio waves. He never suspected that the very machines used to secure his army were baring its throat. The ultra-arithmetic was a silent executioner. It dismantled the Afrika Korps ship by ship, rotor by rotor. By late 1942, the British were reading German orders as fast as the German generals were receiving them. The lack of fuel began to change the physical behavior of the army. Rommel had to stop his famous sweeps across the desert. His tanks were forced to sit still to save every drop of gasoline. A stationary tank is a target, not a weapon. The tankers were gone. Now the remaining supplies had to survive a logistics nightmare on land. Rommel was over 600 miles from his primary port. The desert was about to collect a massive tax on his remaining trucks. The 600-mile nightmare was beginning. The desert is not a battlefield. It is an ocean of stone and heat. In this ocean, distance is the ultimate predator. Rommel's advance into Egypt created a logistics gap that defied the laws of physics. By July 1942, his front line at El Alamein was over 1,300 miles from his main supply base at Tripoli. Even the secondary port of Benghazi was 650 miles away. These were not just numbers on a map. They were a death sentence for his mechanical endurance. The Afrika Korps lived and died by the Via Balbia. This was the only paved road that spanned the North African coast. It was a single, fragile thread of asphalt. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition, and every loaf of bread had to travel this road. The desert began to collect a massive tax on every mile. To move supplies, Rommel relied on the Opel Blitz and the Mercedes-Benz L3000. These were excellent trucks, but they were not designed for the Sahara. The fine sand acted like an abrasive powder. It entered the cylinders. It chewed through the bearings. It destroyed the radiators. A truck that left Tripoli with a full load was a different machine by the time it reached the front. It was worn, overheated, and leaking. Then there was the arithmetic of the fuel itself. This is the logistics paradox. To move fuel to the front, the trucks had to burn fuel. A German standard truck consumed nearly 1 gallon of fuel for every 5 miles in desert conditions. On a 600-mile trip, the truck burned a massive portion of its own cargo just to complete the journey. By the time the convoy reached the Panzer divisions, the net gain was tiny. The Afrika Korps was spending its energy just to stand still. Rommel tried to supplement his fleet with captured British vehicles. He used thousands of Morris and Chevrolet trucks. By late 1942, nearly 85% of his transport fleet was comprised of captured enemy hardware. This created a new technical nightmare. The German mechanics did not have the correct spare parts for British engines. They had to cannibalize 3 trucks just to keep one moving. The Desert Fox was now driving a Frankenstein army. It was held together by wire, stolen parts, and desperation. The British Desert Air Force knew the Via Balbia was the Axis throat. They targeted the supply columns with relentless precision. Kitty Hawks and Beaufighters prowled the road. They didn't target the tanks. They targeted the tankers and the water trucks. A single strafing run could destroy a week's worth of fuel for a battalion. The road was littered with the charred skeletons of the German transport service. Rommel's men called the road the graveyard of the Afrika Korps. It was a landscape of black smoke and twisted steel. The heat was an additional enemy. In the midday sun, the temperature inside a truck cabin could reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The drivers were exhausted. They suffered from dysentery and heat stroke. The human element was breaking down alongside the machines. Rommel ignored the warnings from his logistics officers. He believed that one more victory would capture the British stockpiles in Alexandria. He was gambling on the hope that the enemy would provide the fuel he couldn't transport himself. But the British were no longer leaving their fuel behind. They were adopting a policy of scorched earth. Every time they retreated, they blew up the fuel dumps. They contaminated the wells with salt and oil. Rommel was chasing a prize that vanished the moments he reached it. He was running toward a desert that offered nothing but salt and sand. The 600-mile nightmare had stripped his army of its mobility. His panzers were now on a strict starvation diet of gasoline. He was reaching the end of the road, and at the end of that road was a geographic bottleneck that he couldn't bypass. The sand was about to stop moving. The war of maneuver was about to hit a wall. The bottleneck at El Alamein was waiting. The Desert War was usually a game of infinite space. It was a war of the long hook. If an enemy blocked your path, you simply drove 50 miles south and went around them. Rommel was a master of this maneuver. He used the vastness of the Sahara like an ocean, but at El Alamein, the ocean disappeared. Geography became a rigid cage. The battlefield was a narrow gap only 40 miles wide. To the north was the Mediterranean Sea. This was a hard boundary of water. To the south was the Qattara Depression. This was a massive geological sinkhole. It sat hundreds of feet below sea level. The depression was filled with salt marshes and soft, treacherous sand. It was impassable for tanks and heavy trucks. For the first time in the North African campaign, there was no around. There was only through. This bottleneck was a technical disaster for the Axis style of war. The Afrika Korps relied on high-speed, flanking movements to bypass British defenses. At El Alamein, the British under General Claude Auchinleck realized they finally had an anchor. They could dig in and stretch their lines from the sea to the depression. Rommel arrived at this bottleneck in July 1942. His men were exhausted. His vehicles were falling apart from the 600-mile trek. He tried to break the line immediately. He used his remaining panzers in a series of violent frontal assaults. But the British had built boxes. They were fortified positions protected by deep minefields and anti-tank guns. The Axis tanks were funneled into narrow killing zones. They couldn't use their superior speed. They were forced into a static battle of attrition. Rommel's fuel situation turned the bottleneck into a graveyard. To break a fortified line, You need a massive surplus of energy. You need fuel to keep the engines running during long, low-gear crawls through sand. You need ammunition for sustained barrages. Rommel had neither. He was fighting with a bare-cupboard logistics system. The first battle of El Alamein in July ended in a stalemate. This was a strategic defeat for the Desert Fox. In a stalemate, the side with the shorter supply line wins. The British were only 60 miles from their massive base at Alexandria. They could replace a lost tank in 24 hours. Rommel had to wait weeks for a replacement that might be sunk by Ultra before it arrived. The bottleneck forced the Axis into a standstill. It turned the fluid war of the desert into a trench war reminiscent of 1914. Rommel realized he was trapped. He began to build his own defenses. He called them the Devil's Gardens. He laid hundreds of thousands of mines. He hoped to hold the line while he waited for a miracle from the Mediterranean. But the miracle never came. Instead, a new British commander arrived. He didn't believe in the gentleman's duel of the desert. He believed in the cold application of industrial weight. The clock was ticking. The British were building an army that Rommel's depleted forces couldn't possibly stop. Montgomery's industrial clock was about to start. The stalemate at El Alamein was a gift to the British. It allowed them to replace their leadership. In August 1942, General Bernard Montgomery took command of the Eighth Army. Montgomery was not a man of flair. He was a man of iron discipline. He viewed the desert not as a stage for heroics, but as a problem of industrial output. He arrived with a specific mandate. He refused to launch an offensive until his numbers were overwhelming. He was building a machine designed to crush the Afrika Korps through sheer mass. While Rommel begged for fuel, Montgomery watched the port of Alexandria. Every day, the cranes lifted new hardware onto the docks. The most significant arrival was the M4 Sherman tank. This was the pinnacle of American industrial power. The British received over 300 Shermans just in time for the battle. This tank changed the technical balance of the desert. The Sherman featured a 75-millimeter dual-purpose gun. Unlike earlier British tanks, it could fire high-explosive shells at anti-tank guns. It was also incredibly reliable. It didn't break down in the sand like the German Panzers. It was built for the long grind. By October 1942, the arithmetic was terrifying for the Axis. Montgomery had gathered over 190,000 men. Rommel had roughly 116,000, and many were malnourished. The tank count was even worse for the Germans. Montgomery had 1,029 tanks, ready for action. Rommel had only 547, and nearly half were obsolete Italian models. Montgomery also accumulated a massive surplus of artillery. He gathered over 800 guns. He planned to use them to create a wall of fire. He called his plan Operation Lightfoot. It was not based on speed. It was based on a slow, methodical advance. He intended to eat through the German lines. He would use his superior numbers to trade one British life for one German life. In a war of attrition, the side with the bigger factory always wins. Montgomery knew he could replace his losses. He knew Rommel could not. The British supply lines were now only 60 miles long. They were protected by a massive air umbrella. The Desert Air Force now owned the sky. They flew over 1,500 sorties in the days leading up to the attack. Rommel watched the build-up with a sense of dread. He was master of the sword, but he was being attacked by a sledgehammer. He knew he couldn't outmaneuver Montgomery in the narrow gap. He had to make the gap impassable. He turned to the only resource he had in abundance: explosives. He began to pave the desert with a hidden, lethal geometry. The Devil's Gardens were about to be planted. Rommel knew he could no longer win a race. He had to win a stand. He turned the El Alamein Gap into a nightmare of hidden metal. He called these defensive belts the Teufelsgarten, the Devil's Gardens. The Axis engineers sowed over 445,000 mines into the sand. This became the most densely mined area of the entire war. They used the Tellermine 42. This was a heavy anti-tank mine. It contained nearly 12 pounds of TNT. It was designed to shatter the tracks of a Sherman or a Crusader tank. It turned a mobile weapon into a stationary target. Between the anti-tank mines, they planted the S mine. This was the Bouncing Betty. This was a lethal anti-personnel weapon. When triggered, a small charge launched the mine 3 feet into the air. It then exploded at waist height. It sprayed thousands of steel balls in every direction. The mines were not laid in simple rows. They were laid in deep, overlapping belts. These belts were miles deep. They were integrated with barbed wire and hidden tripwires. The goal was to slow the British advance to a crawl. Rommel wanted to force the British engineers to clear the mines by hand. He wanted them to do this under constant fire of machine guns and mortars. Behind the minefields, Rommel placed his heavy hitters. These were the 88mm flak guns. The mines funneled the British tanks into narrow corridors. The 88s were sighted at the end of these paths. It was a lethal geometry. If a tank moved left or right, it hit a mine. If it stayed on the path, it was hit by a high-velocity 88mm shell. Montgomery's men had to advance through this labyrinth in the dark. They used primitive metal detectors called mine detectors. They also used bayonets to prod the sand at a 45-degree angle. It was a terrifying, slow-motion battle. The Gardens worked. They turned the first nights of the Second Battle of El Alamein into a bloody grind. But a static defense has a fatal weakness. It is a wall that cannot move. If the British punched through one section of the wall, Rommel had to react. He had to move his panzer divisions to the breakthrough point. To move, he needed the one resource that was currently at the bottom of the Mediterranean. He needed fuel, and the fuel was gone. The fuel ghost was about to haunt the front line. On October 24th, 1942, Rommel returned to Africa from sick leave. He found his army in a state of technical cardiac arrest. The British barrage had begun. Montgomery was punching holes in the Devil's Gardens. Rommel needed to launch a massive counterattack. He needed to move his panzers from the south to the north. But his fuel tanks were empty. The fuel ghost had finally arrived. Every time a panzer commander started his engine, he was performing a dangerous calculation. He didn't have enough fuel to fight and retreat. He only had enough to do one. Rommel's daily requirement was roughly 400 tons of fuel just to maintain basic operations. By the third day of the battle, he was receiving less than 40 tons per day. The arithmetic of defeat was now visible on every dashboard. The last hope for the Axis was a tanker named the Proserpina. It was carrying over 4,500 tons of fuel. Ultra had already told the British where it was. On October 26th, British bombers found the ship. They sent it to the bottom of the sea. Rommel watched the horizon for the smoke of the supply ships. He saw nothing but the fires of his own burning tanks. Without fuel, the panzers couldn't maneuver. They became static pillboxes. A stationary tank in the desert is a dead tank. The British artillery began to pick them off one by one. Rommel realized his army was no longer a mobile force. It was a collection of iron statues waiting for the end. He sent a desperate message to Hitler. He explained that the lack of fuel made further resistance impossible. He asked for permission to retreat. He wanted to save what was left of his veteran divisions. Hitler's response was a shock to the system. He ordered Rommel to stand and die. He told the field marshal that there was no path but victory or death. Rommel was a soldier of duty, but he was also a realist. He looked at his fuel gauges. They were all pointing at zero. The Desert Fox decided to commit the ultimate act of disobedience. He chose to save his men. He chose to run. The long retreat was about to begin. It was a race against a clock that had already run out of time. On October 4th, 1942, The Axis line at El Alamein finally snapped. Montgomery's heavy armor had chewed through the Devil's Gardens. The British 7th Armored Division was pouring into the open desert. Rommel looked at his status reports. They were a map of total collapse. He had started the battle with over 500 tanks. He was now down to fewer than 20. The fuel crisis had forced a brutal, cold-blooded hierarchy. Every remaining drop of gasoline was siphoned into the German motorized units. This left the Italian infantry divisions stranded in the sand. They had no trucks. They had no transport. Thousands of soldiers were abandoned to the desert heat. They were walkers in a war of machines. Most were captured within 48 hours. Rommel ignored Hitler's victory or death order for the second time. He ordered a full-scale withdrawal. This began the longest retreat in military history. It was a 2,000-mile sprint across the top of Africa. The Afrika Korps was no longer a fighting force. It was a collection of survivors. They abandoned their heavy guns. They abandoned their wounded. The British scorched earth policy was now working against the Germans. Every well they reached was poisoned. Every fuel dump was a pile of ash. By January 1943, Rommel reached Tripoli. This was the port he had started from 2 years earlier. He didn't stop. He kept moving west toward Tunisia. He hoped the shorter supply lines in Tunisia would save his army, but the arithmetic of the war had shifted again. While Rommel was retreating from the east, the Americans had landed in the west. This was Operation Torch. The Desert Fox was now caught in a continental pincer. He was trapped between Montgomery's 8th Army and Eisenhower's new divisions. In March 1943, Rommel was evacuated to Germany. He left behind the men he had led for 2 years. On May 13, 1943, the final Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. The statistics of the defeat were staggering. Over 230,000 Axis soldiers were taken prisoner. This was a catastrophe on the scale of Stalingrad. It was the total evaporation of the Axis presence in Africa. The dream of the Suez Canal was buried under the sand. The Mediterranean was now an Allied lake. Rommel's tactical brilliance had been defeated by a simple, unyielding fact. He had run out of road because he had run out of fuel. The destruction of the Afrika Korps was not a failure of the soldier. It was a failure of the command. Erwin Rommel was a master of the maneuver, but he forgot that a tank is only as good as the ship that carries its fuel. His fatal mistake was the choice he made at Tobruk. He chose the speed of the advance over the security of the supply line. By postponing the invasion of Malta, he left a predator at his back. He allowed the ultra-arithmetic to dismantle his army one tanker at a time. It is a lesson in the cold reality of war. Bravery can win a battle, but only logistics can win a campaign. The Desert Fox learned that in the Sahara, the most powerful weapon isn't a gun, it's a full fuel tank. If you found this breakdown of the North African collapse insightful, hit the like button. Subscribe to follow our deep dives into the decisions that changed history. Leave a comment below. If you were in Rommel's position, would you have prioritized the invasion of Malta or the drive to Cairo? Thank you for watching.